Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Public Voices by NEOGOV. I'm your host, Doug, here with my co host and friend, Nicole.
Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about performance improvement plans and what happens if we stop seeing them as a punishment. Before we jump in, let's take a quick second to thank our sponsor, NeoGov, who makes this podcast possible. Are you ready to get started?
Let's do this. This is a big one. So, all right, Nicole, with all of your experience, this one is just right in your wheelhouse. When people hear performance improvement plan or PIP, they brace for the worst, right? So, why exactly does a PIP have that kind of reputation? And is that reputation necessarily deserved?
Yeah, so I do think the reputation is deserved, unfortunately. I think that I know, not I think, in my career, I've only seen a PIP successfully administered one time in 20 years, which says a lot, right? I think that really the fault comes with PIPs not being successful because of the way that they're initially delivered. A lot of leaders take it as something that they have to do before someone is fired. And so it's usually delivered either literally said or with a tone of because HR is making me do this. And it's not coming from a place of I want to help you get better. And so immediately the employee is likely to shut down and get defensive. And then it just never really seems to recover from there.
Yeah. So, how do you think we got to this point with PIPs? And I have the same experience with you, except I can't think of a time where a PIP actually has worked out really well. And I'm honestly, before we dove into this whole thing, I thought of like instances where something was done, and I'm like, okay, that was actually a success story, but I can't think of one. And I think about the fear that's associated with the PIP, and How do you think this all came about? Like to be it's almost a last straw sort of feel. What do you think brought that on?
Well, I think it's a lot of buildup, right? I think leaders do not do a good job of having conversations day to day. And so typically, when an employee is told they're being put on a PIP, they are very surprised because they've gone months, if not years, thinking that they're doing a really good job. And leadership has failed to be honest with them, they failed to be clear. And so, again, the employee has this assumption that they're doing well, everything's fine. And then they're told, you have 6 months to get it together or you might not work here anymore. And so that fear is real because they kind of feel blindsided by what they're being told by their leadership.
Yeah, it's sometimes it comes on quickly, like really unexpectedly. You're moving along in any kind of whatever position you have to be in the public sector, and things seem to be going well, and all of a sudden you get hit like out of nowhere with a performance improvement plan, and that can and typically does shock employees as to, well, what happened before, what led up to this point where we're also kind of escalating
Mhm,
so high that it becomes to a written plan that at its face seems intimidating.
mhm. Yeah, and it is fascinating, again, going back to leadership, they're struggling to have those conversations because that buildup occurs over time where leaders could maybe stop those problems very early on, solve them, really get to the root of the issue. Maybe it's just simple cross training or a misunderstanding, but because we're not having those interactions and being honest with each other, it just grows and grows, and then we hit them with this pip.
Yeah. So, you've led departments and I've led departments, and a lot of our listeners and viewers have or are currently leading agencies. So how have you, or how would you recommend that leaders can kind of create this culture where feedback like a PIP or something leading up to a PIP is sort of expected instead of something to be fearful of? Like, what's that look like to you? What are some instances in your time where you've been successful with that?
Yeah, I think one piece of guidance I always gave leaders was to do consistent one on ones and just have those regular meetings or biweekly meetings with employees to build trust and rapport. And you're giving that feedback to each other, and it becomes a normal part of your day to day. I think, again, if we're not having those conversations, there's always tension, even on the leader side, to deliver basic feedback, let alone deliver a PIP. And so I think there's so much power in making sure that leaders are having those consistent interactions with their employees and not just doing the basic check-in. I've worked with leaders that say, "Well, I ask them every day. I say good morning and say, how are you doing?" But that's very different than we're talking about your work. We're talking about how your customer service is or the projects you're working on. And so, yes, it's great to have those personal interactions and check in on the surface level, but there needs to be a deeper dive on a regular basis to build that trust and rapport.
But how do you and how have you seen and, this is I'm gonna dig deep on this one
I
because
love it.
setting
I love
I
it.
know, right? We've got so
Yeah.
more meetings on the calendar. Yeah, everybody
Yes.
loves more meetings. And so you do a like a check-in, and as a chief, I had an assistant chief and some deputy chiefs, and we all sort of worked together and did our thing, and I would have regular meetings on the calendar. But I'm just gonna freely admit that
Mhm.
sometimes when an assistant chief would come in and we'd have a one-on-one, it it wasn't as productive as I would have liked because we just started talking about everything else. But
Yeah.
there was no format to it. Like there was no as they walk out of this meeting, they knew, okay, well, these are things that I need to really look at or things that I've done really well and I need to build on that. And I'm guilty as anybody else on that. So how do you get focus with all the
Mhm.
meetings and all the things that leaders and managers have in their lives? How do you build that focus into something to get that consistent feedback, which is what you just touched on?
Yeah. So one thing that I did with my team that really seemed to work well is I had like a template meeting agenda, and it was, what are you working on? What do you need help with? And what is completed? And then we also would talk about their annual goals every meeting. And so that was something that they had to complete before each one-on-one, and, bring up, this is where I'm at with these projects, or this is what I need help with. And so it would help us stay on track. And sometimes, you do just start talking about their kids' soccer games and you do get off track. So either extend the meeting, right? So you can get to the business, or, add another meeting to say, hey, we did a lot of personal chit chat today. Let's get 30 minutes on the calendar tomorrow so we don't lose track of where we've been and lose our progress. But what I see is managers have good intentions, and they do put it on the calendar, and they do either let it be personal, or something pops up and they cancel the meeting. And so I always talk to leaders about, yes, it's okay if something popped up, but try to just reschedule the next day or maybe 2 days out, but don't just keep canceling, because then you lose that connection. And so really try to put time into it. When do the math, and if you meet with your employee an hour or 2 every month, that's like 1% of your annual work. And so I think that each employee deserves, 1% of our time for the year
Yeah,
at a minimum, at a minimum.
I absolutely agree with you. And for those of you that are listening or watching, you will quickly learn that Nicole is the organized one of the two of us that has like this plan. So I've worked with her long enough to know that most likely we should do a podcast where Nicole teaches Doug organization skills, and that's part of it. So that's a great way to look at it, and it's something that I know as a leader I probably should work harder on. But let's talk about something that goes with these conversations. Most of the time, the conversations we have with our employees, they go pretty well, but sometimes the difficult conversations are there, and those are just not fun. And let's be honest, most leaders are not trained to have difficult
Mhm.
conversations with people.
Yeah.
And there's this. I can think about all the training that I ever went to, and like multiple thousands of hours, like 3,000 plus
Mhm.
hours of training.
Yeah.
Um, very few instances can I think of in all that time where it's like, here's how to really have a difficult conversation and go through that and see what that looks like with different reactions, whether it's, a wildly shut down, sort of arms crossed, sit
Mhm.
back in your chair reaction or an emotional reaction. So when it comes to those emotional types of reactions, what's something you've seen on the HR side that can be a helpful guide to some of the folks that are listening in on this?
Yeah, I have 2 helpful guides, but I do wanna say I've noticed just in my time working with public safety, it's always fascinated me how public safety leaders avoid conflict with employees, but they love conflict in day to day, right? Like, that is they're professionals at dealing with conflict and dealing with crisis, but when it comes to having a hard conversation with employees, they're like, "Ooh, I actually don't wanna do that." And so it's just fascinating, it doesn't transfer, right? I think one thing is to just acknowledge it's okay to be nervous. We're all uncomfortable having these hard conversations. It's never fun to tell an employee things aren't going well or to give them difficult conversations. But each time you do it, you build confidence and you realize that you can navigate it better. I've had hard conversations with people for 20 years. It's not easy for me. I just know how to navigate that uneasy feeling better, and I'm more confident in my ability to respond. And so avoidance is the worst thing that we can do because it just gets so much worse. And the other thing too, I think is, and I've done this with leaders, is to have them draft out a script of like key points you want to hit. And you don't have to, be a robot and be like, I have to read this, but just what are the key points? Because depending on their reaction, you may get off topic. And so it's like, oh, I only checked two of those things I want to talk about. Here's the third one. And even play that out with other leaders, or I've done role playing with employees to do exactly what you just said. Okay, let's role play that the employee does have an outburst. How are you going to respond? Let's role play that they shut down. How are you going to respond? And again, just kind of getting in that practice and building confidence, because it isn't fun, but as leaders we have to do it. It's the right thing to do. And yeah, I just avoidance is the worst.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, but when, in the absence of information, people will fill in the blank, and
Mhm.
the problem becomes like exponentially worse in their minds than what it actually is. And after the meeting, they're like, "Oh, I thought it was going to be much worse than that." For example, so
Yes.
that happens all the time, and I'm again guilty as charged on that too. And going back to your earlier point, which I love about public safety leaders, we deal with external conflict all the time, but
Mhm.
internally we're like, not so much. And I can think
Mhm.
of I would rather go. I did like hostage negotiations for a
Yes.
while, and I would
Yes.
so much rather go out to a scene and talk to
Yeah.
somebody for like 8 hours and try and get them to
Right.
stop doing whatever they're doing than
Mhm.
I would ever have like this is a tough conversation. So I think
Yeah.
it's just that human weird nature that we are as public servants. I don't know, who knows, but
Well, and I think it goes back to the confidence, right? You have training, you have done it 100 times, so you know what's gonna happen in a negotiation that way, where like you said, we aren't training our staff to have those hard conversations, and we aren't necessarily putting them in situations where they can build that confidence, and so more reps equals more confidence, and, it doesn't get easier, but it's
no, it
worth it
definitely
to do it.
it definitely doesn't. So when you see people, and I'm sure you've had it happen, and I've had it happen too, when people get emotional.
Mhm.
Which again, human nature, human reaction. This is their job, this is their livelihood, and a PIP can feel super intimidating and just kind of you feel bad about it. And so people can have emotional reactions. What things have you seen when you've had maybe somebody else in the room with you and you're having this conversation with somebody, or maybe you've heard of stories or whatever else where somebody has become emotional, and how has that gone bad in certain circumstances? Like, can you think of some instances where, ooh, that just did not go well at all, or maybe it did go well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like you said, one thing that we always fear the worst. So we always fear an outburst, raising voices and that sort of thing. But I've really seen, especially in conversations about performance and maybe discipline, employees more or less shut down because they're embarrassed. And so they stop listening, and they might get defensive, but it's typically more that quiet reaction. And then they think about it and then they get upset later. Right. But in the moment they feel so embarrassed that it's happening that that outburst doesn't exist. I think, in situations like this, when you know your employee is likely to be volatile, I always had PD on standby just outside the room, depending on the situation, just in case it got a little out of hand. But I also think depending on the employee, and again, it's super important to know your employee. Employees use that as a way to manipulate their leaders. So I had a male supervisor that was struggling with performance with a female employee, and he was terrified to have that conversation and just talk to her on a very basic level because he said she was going to cry. He said, "What if she cries? What if she cries?" I was like, "What if she cries?" Right? Let her cry, and maybe you give her 5 minutes to have her moment and have her show, because we know it's a show at this point. It's happened a lot of times, right? That's She knows that makes him uncomfortable and that he'll shut down, and she just thinks the conversation isn't gonna continue. So let that happen and, wait it out and say, "Okay, we'll revisit this when you collect yourself," or just say, "This is getting too heated right now. We'll revisit in the morning," right? But I think you can't let employees get out of that conversation because they're having that emotional response, because that might be part of the performance that they have to work on, is their self-control and their emotional regulation. And so we can't just have these big reactions and then think we don't have to deal with those consequences.
Have you seen really any good ways or any kind of programs or anything where people have been like better trained to address these types of things, or is it just a kind of we're going to work on it separately, we're going to try and build people up so they can have these types of conversations to know how to navigate them, because there's really not much out there about how to really go through these kinds of conversations. It's like this weird gray area of
Yeah.
leading people.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily know of any resources, but I actually taught a class called The Compliment Sandwich Isn't Very Tasty. And we talked about how we're all taught to give that compliment sandwich. We start with a positive, we give them a negative, and then a positive. And really, when you look at the research, the employee only hears the positives, right? They only hear the start and the end, and they just kind of dismiss the middle. And so I taught leaders how when you're it's okay to tell employees they're doing well or they're not doing well, but you have to do it at separate times so there's no confusion. But part of that is I actually came up with little scenario cards and made them all role play. And they just did little 5-minute skits with each other. And they got a card that they had to talk to their employee, and their response was, I'm dealing with an abusive relationship. Or maybe they have a child that's dealing with drug issues. Or, I just gave them all these things. Some were kind of funny, some were very serious, but they had to learn how to react. And I paired them with people that they didn't necessarily work with, so they couldn't joke through it. They had to be serious. And role playing is very hard. We do role playing a lot here at NEOGOV, and it makes me uncomfortable too. But there is something to be said about just feeling that uncomfortable feeling and knowing you can work through it.
And let's be really clear to everybody. I think we're both very, very strong proponents of advocating that, when we talk about performance within the people that we have in our charge, the people that we're supposed to be caring for and developing and mentoring and all those things, these types of conversations should never, ever, ever start with a PIP. That's not where you start.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
that's one of those things that it's kind of a non-negotiable sort of thing because of the weight and kind of the reputation behind the PIP. You've got to kind of be, I would say, much more ahead of the game in terms of how we treat people and how we try and build them up. And I think for me, that's a respect thing as a leader.
Mhm,
I mean, you owe that level of respect to the people in your care and in your charge, and having those honest conversations, which are difficult,
mhm.
are still just as important. And I'm the kind of person that if you have an issue with me, I would rather hear it honestly and upfront. Don't beat around the bush. You talked about the sandwich and the compliment and the problem and the
Mm.
compliment. So I mean, just take the bread off and just give me the stuff that I want to
Yes,
deal with. Right?
exactly,
That's the way
exactly.
I tend to react better more to it because to me it takes courage to give me that information, but also it's more helpful to me to try and figure out what that problem is, and then hopefully my manager, my leader, can help me walk through what that looks like to improve upon that process.
Exactly. And I think it's easier to deliver a PIP if your employee feels like you've been helping them for 3 to 6 months ahead of time. And you can say, hey, we've been working on this together and I still haven't seen the improvement I need to see. So now we're going to do the PIP. But you have to be able, as a leader, to show your part in that, right? Because PIPs are a lot of work, not only for the employee, but also for the leader. And if they are not done correctly, it can turn into a whole disaster, and so I always gave guidance of, if you are not willing to put in the work on both sides, don't do a PIP because it will not end well, and you're just asking people to check boxes, and they're not truly developing. You're just giving them these tasks to do, but that's not helping them create better habits or create better skills, and so leaders really have to do their part and show their ability to mentor through that process.
Yeah, and I love what you said there. And I don't think people think of this a lot
Mhm.
because when we give a PIP and somebody's on a performance improvement plan, we sort of hand it off to them and it's almost like, here you go, good luck. But we forget that there's another side to that, which is our responsibility as a leader to make sure that we help walk with them through that and help them
Mhm.
accomplish that goal. So,
Mhm.
I mean, that I think that comes back to the whole feeling that the PIP is basically next stop being fired. Basically, that's
Yes.
how it's been kind of felt with, and I or dealt with, and I think that's always been sort of that way. So instead, though, and with your reframing, looking at a PIP as a look, this is a two-person thing. This is me as your leader and you as the person that needs to improve upon the performance. But this is both of us working in concert and working together to try and accomplish something because ultimately
Mhm.
that's the goal is to work better as a team. I don't think a lot of
Yes.
people think of it that way.
Right. And the one example where I saw it go well, it was delivered just like that, that I am here to help you get better. We're going to, navigate all of these things that you need to work on together. And one of the things in my organization that we required was monthly updates. So that they had so the leader was accountable to show what they're doing with their employee and what progress was being made. And in that scenario, every month, just from the memo that the supervisor sent me, I could read, yes, your employee is progressing, your employee is doing well. And then it also said, next month, this is what we're going to work on. And so I knew he was meeting with her regularly. They truly were meeting those goals and those metrics that they wanted to. And at the end of it, this is a thing that I had never seen done before. They actually had the employee deliver kind of like a recap of her PIP experience to from frontline supervisor all the way up to director. And she shared that at the beginning, she shut down. She thought, you guys are trying to fire me. But they delivered it in a way where they told her, this isn't a mar on you professionally. It's an opportunity for you to get better and become a better employee and a better mentor to your peers. And so she said she had to take time to think about it. And she really did her part to say, yep, I can get better on these things, and then put in the effort every month. And so I think, again, when everyone's working together, there's so much power in that. But she had to, she had to reflect and realize she needed to do work. The leader had to do the reflection and um, offer additional assistance or guidance to her. And so everyone has to work together for it to be a success. It's not one sided.
Yeah, that's so many things that are happening there, but in a really good way. And I love that vulnerability to get up and say, at first, look, I was not happy at all about it, but here's what I did, and here's how I felt I was
Hmm.
supported in that journey, and that's that success story that I think we're always searching for.
Hmm.
And
Absolutely.
in those cases, especially in today's workforce, I mean, you think about the people we're hiring. They're not there just for the check. They want to be mentored. They want to feel like they're coached. They want to feel like there's going to be growth in their career. And as we've said on previous episodes, people are leaving jobs all the time now because they just don't feel like they're part of something bigger than them. And when you don't have that opportunity, it feels like a dead end job. It feels like just a job. So, on today's workforce, I think that dual role of really kind of growing together and building performance is probably pretty important.
Yeah. Absolutely. And in that example, again, she throughout her presentation kept giving credit to her leaders for her doing well. And so when she was done, I said, yes, your leaders have done a really great job implementing this and carrying this out for the last few months. But have you really taken a moment to realize what you've done? Because you did the hard work too, right? If you need to give yourself credit. And she paused and she was like, no, no, I've just been giving my leadership all the credit. And so it was her team. There were instances where she shared where her team was aware that she was going through something and they all supported her. And so everyone. It was a very holistic approach, and I think that's why it was successful.
So, what happens when we ignore it? Like, what?
Oh god.
I don't want to deal with it. I'm
All
just
the
going to
bad
ignore
things.
it. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
tell me what happens.
well, I think you like you said, you kind of get to the point where you skip a PIP and end up terminating someone, and so
Mhm.
depending on the employee and the situation, the question is, could we have done more to save them? Could we have done more to help them? Because depending on how long they've been there, the organization has put a lot of time and money into that person, and they've built relationships with coworkers, with the community. And so, did we do them a disservice by not managing their performance well and then just cutting them off? But I think not dealing with it, we've talked about that analogy of the rotten strawberries, the moldy strawberries, like
Mhm.
it really just grows very quickly. And sometimes it is too challenging to undo the lack of leadership that we've displayed.
Yeah. And I can think of so many people that have, had challenges in their work, but they've been really successful in the end. But even though they've experienced these setbacks, these challenges, they've still been so successful in their careers. But I think it's
Mhm.
because it's been managed the right way.
Yes, and timely too, right? And
Yeah.
when those lessons pop up, they can tell a peer, "Hey, I experienced that too in my first 5 years, and here's what I did to overcome it, and here's kind of the lessons learned. Maybe you could try this." And so share that amongst each other as well, because none of us are perfect, and so if we all can help each other be better, it's really powerful.
Yeah, that's great. So this is the point of our podcast where we do our takeaways. This is like a thing
Mm,
we do, and
my
so
favorite.
it's my favorite. But today I get to go first because I've
Okay,
been
good.
like hard hitting you with questions this whole time, and there's so many things that are takeaways for me, and you really hit a moment for me earlier when you really reframed the whole two-way street on the PIP. It's not just here's the employee thing, but it's also the supervisor. And it made me think back of like, in times, did I do enough?
Sure.
Did I participate enough in that process to help that employee along? And that's, when you think about those things, that reframing of this is going to be hard work, but it takes two of us to continue on. I think that's a super important takeaway for those folks that are listening on this. So for me, there's been a ton of things, but that's one of the ones that really stands out for me. What about you?
Yeah. So I think it was great for you to, reaffirm my belief that police don't like personnel conflict. That was really great because I've never really said that out loud. It's just been an observation.
Is this an
Um,
intervention? I feel like this is an
yeah, yeah,
intervention.
yeah,
Okay. All right. I
yeah,
was just checking.
exactly.
Yep. Okay.
But I think, my takeaway with PIP is they really are there to be a tool, and it will take a lot of work in organizations because there's so much legacy of negativity behind them, but they can be a tool to help someone succeed and be better. But again, everyone has to be involved in that to make it turn into a positive or be perceived as something that's going to help me be better versus you're trying to fire me.
Yeah. That's great. What a good one today. This was fun and it was educational. So I appreciate talking with you again on all these things that are so important about dealing with the most important thing that we have in our jobs, which are our employees, right? The people
Mhm.
that go out and do the work. So on behalf of Nicole and I, thank you to everyone for joining us on yet another episode of Public Voices. And if you liked what you heard today, you got to forward this on to your colleagues, your friend, your family, pretty much everybody. And don't forget to subscribe and rate us wherever you happen to stream your podcasts. And of course, a huge shout out to our sponsor, NEOGOV, which helps government HR and public safety agencies work smarter with AI, automation, and configuration. You can learn more about NEOGOV at neogov.com. Thanks for joining us today, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.